Welcome to episode 25 of Contrarian Corner. I'm Ben Kelleran. Today we have a very special guest on to talk to us about the election, what's going to happen over the next 3 months before Trump gets inaugurated, and anything else on the geopolitical side, financial markets, and basically what's going on in the world. And he has a very interesting background. But EM, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's good to meet.
Yeah, if you want to give my listeners a little bit of a background, a little bit of story on kind of who you are, how you ended up kind of talking about some of this stuff. I first heard about your kind of comments and what you're looking at on the Coffee and a Mic podcast, and you had some interesting stuff to say on financial markets, on current events, and all that. So if you could give a quick rundown of who you are, kind of how you got here, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think I got here by accident, quite frankly, like many of us. Yeah, I started out in San Francisco when I was young. We don't have to go back, but went back in the mid '90s for tech, to get the tech space. Did a fintech company. I wasn't a big player in it, but I was working with the executive founders and learned a lot. Founded two telecommunications tech companies afterwards. Went into the investor side of things as an analyst, primarily in China for infrastructure and tech, mostly tech, telecommunications technology, telecommunications infrastructure, digital media companies, tech transfer, media transfer, and then some things like pebble bed nuclear reactors, power generation, water distribution, et cetera. Came back to the US, helped stand up a couple of boutique investment banks, myself on the strategy and logic side of things. Stumbled into algorithmic high frequency trading, worked for a yacht as a CFO for a yacht building company for a year in Europe, which was interesting. And then in my early 40s, I went into special forces to become a Green Beret, spent 11 years doing that. The last 4, I was doing doctoral studies in computational science and engineering. To kind of understand where we are, how does the back end of the informational space, the confluence with that and the data brokers and the markets in particular, because I was looking to build an AI, a high frequency trading platform, and where were we there and where was AI and et cetera. And then some physical brain injuries from military service derailed me, and which turned out to be a great thing. So I spent 4 years working on that, rebuilding. Now I do neural studies. Mostly I collate work from other people, putting it together, and then finding treatment and diagnostic modalities for people with traumatic brain injuries. So.
Interesting. That's a very wide and varied set of experiences, but I think it gives you a good view of a lot of different things going on. But I think it'd be good to start after last night's election results with what's going on there, because if it plays out like some of the states are leaning, it looks like the electoral map I kind of pulled out of my ass and put on my Substack might turn out to be pretty close to the actual outcome. But as far as Trump getting into office kind of the next 3 months before inauguration, what do you think that looks like? Is there geopolitical stuff that might flare up, or things that will kind of come up in the so-called lawfare system that might try and derail anything before January?
Yeah, so that's a pretty broad question there.
Yeah.
Firstly, I'll say, because I was doing open source intelligence work in 2019, 2020, and I was saying back in 2019, they're going to steal this election. And they did, ludicrously. And I was defunded at the time from contracts I was on, et cetera. I am pleasantly surprised and impressed, genuinely impressed, that the legitimacy of the vote, I'm extraordinarily impressed with the amount of effort that went into ensuring that there was an actual election. There's going to be little stuff that pops up. We've been seeing all kinds of lawsuits already, but most of it's not election swaying stuff. It's just manipulation that was trying to sway it. But so I'm very impressed. That's an extraordinary amount of effort that's gone in the last 4 years to just have an election outcome like we did last night. And I don't mean rig an election outcome. I mean, prevent the rigging of an election outcome. And I don't think people understand how extensive that effort has been. So now the next 3
Or how
months,
bad it was in 2020.
or how bad it was, and not just 2020. This has been going on for over 40 years, right? California didn't turn blue legitimately, right?
Yeah.
I say as a San Franciscan. The next 3 months, the concerted effort to highlight, draw out, and counter the mob state, which is a Twitter thread I've done, and the Praetorian system, which is another Twitter thread that I've done, series of threads. The efforts that have been done to draw that out and highlight it and counter it, we can't give that effort up, right? So that's going to, for the next 12 years at least, and for your generation, your whole lives, we're going to have to deal with this thing that's over a century old. It doesn't go away with an election. So over the next 3 months, there'll be all kinds of little things that happen, probably not so much with the federal level, but at state levels, county levels, municipal levels, et cetera, which is where real power actually resides. Power at the top is a accumulation of all that smaller power in the lower tiers, right? And so we need to keep our eyes on that. There's going to be all kinds of shenanigans that happen there to get certain people into office to set up for 2008. I don't suspect, and I said this, I think, with Mike, I don't suspect there's going to be violence, that everybody's talking about, et cetera. After the last 4 years, last 4 years or so, if the losing side went to violence now, it would get a pretty strong response from maybe 80% of the Americans, right? So I don't suspect that's going to happen. I think it's going to be a lot of lawfare. Not so much directed at the senatorial level, federal senatorial, Congress, the Senate, or the president, but at all the other layers below. What is happening, and having studied power and history very closely for 5 decades now, there have been an immense amount of negotiations that have been going on behind the scenes of who's not going to prison, who's not going to lose their wealth. I suspect some people probably, and I mean some names, probably will go to prison for things that they legitimately did. I suspect a whole lot of people are going to take early retirement or just legitimate retirement and take themselves off the board. There's going to be a ludicrous amount of evidence hiding, a whole lot of ass covering, forgive my language, and an immense amount of negotiations and discussions of you either take your oath seriously and execute your oath as a public servant as you swore it from now and moving forward, or there is going to be legal action against you, legitimate legal action. I suspect that's what's happening over the next 3 months or so, is the bureaucratic state is figuring out how to prevent the incoming power from actually being able to do anything for the next 4 years. And they've already been working on that, right, for 4 years, but I suspect that's going to accelerate. But I suspect mostly what's going to happen is a whole lot of people who should probably go to jail for doing illegal shit are going to be negotiating their asses off and positioning as much as they can with the incoming regime so that they don't go to jail and lose their pensions and promotions and payroll, et cetera.
Yeah, that kind of leads right into where I wanted to go with some of the factions of power that you kind of had talked about a little bit on Mike's podcast, but I think is starting to become more evident to a lot of people. And you look at some of the power centers in Europe, some of the stuff here with like the PayPal mafia and Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and all these different types, and there's kind of a complicated web of all these different groups kind of jockeying for position in kind of lead up to the election. And now it'll be interesting to see kind of how things play out now that the results are out. But I think one of the things I've heard on Biden is that it didn't look like he was campaigning very hard for Kamala. So there's probably a deal somewhere in a back room where Hunter Biden might be getting a pardon once Trump is in or something like that. So I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Biden himself may be getting a pardon.
Yeah,
right?
That would be. I mean, if you look at Burisma and some of the stuff in China, it's like there's enough there to like really go after him if they wanted to. But
the thing is over the next 3 months, that's part of the power negotiations. Biden can pardon himself and his son, right? Then there's a matter of going after the ill-gotten gains, right? Because there's two sides of things. One is the legal side of things, of going after, charging, taking through the courts and putting people in prison for illegality. The other part is, how do you take the assets from? And the honest truth is most of these people only care about the assets that they ill-gotten gained. With respect to Europe in particular, which is what Mike and I touched on a little bit, Europe's in a bad place, very, very bad place, particularly the UK. Germany's not too far behind, but the UK in particular is in a very bad place because they've been counting on a world war to reset the capital system and to hinder the United States, now that it's on SOFR and it's out of the control of the city of London finally, to continue to keep the American people through warfare and foreign aid in all of its many forms, $1 trillion or $2 trillion a year, which is those funds laundered back through the former colonies, right, in the form of loans and aid, et cetera, all goes back into the banks of Europe or their former colonial owners. And that system's now going to most likely get shut down. And there's going to be a whole lot of arguments and a whole lot of movements about what aid where continues and doesn't because of national security interest, et cetera. But in reality, it's, are we finally going to turn off the modern Marshall Plan of supporting Europe financially? And Europe has, over the last 40 some odd years, deindustrialized itself, heavily indebted itself, heavily bureaucratized itself. Can Europe survive the U.S. Marshall Plan being turned off? And what would they do in the world to get a world war or a civil war in the United States in order to keep this thing going?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because I've kind of said a couple times, like, I think the EU is going to fall apart in the next decade at some point. Just because, I mean, like you said, with the deindustrialization and some of the immigration stuff over there, it's clearly those countries are not being run by people that have the best interests of the people of the country in mind. And you kind of look at what's going on over here, like you said, with SOFR kind of decoupling the banking system a little bit. Like, I think that has more impact than a lot of people will talk about. But I think, especially if you see rates kind of stay more elevated, that you're going to see more capital continue to flow into the U.S. versus picking up 2% on German bonds or whatever. So, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to watch. But as far as the EU and like the start of World War III or potential World War III, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on kind of the geopolitical situation, because it seems like there's a lot of parties that are determined to keep things going in Ukraine, even though it looks like they're really falling apart, or escalate in the Middle East. And I mean, I'd love to see both those situations calm down, but it seems like there are several different parties, several different factions that are determined to escalate things from here. So
we're something with all of the unfunded liabilities and all public debt and derivatives, something like $5 quadrillion in debt. 5 quadrillion, right? We don't have a whole lot of quality collateral coming into the system. There's very little. That's, when Trump and them are talking about drilling and reshoring manufacturing, well, and for capital markets people, what is that? That's collateral. That's actually quality collateral, and baseline, non-derivative, non-financialized returns, right? Revenues. Those will help a lot, substantively. It's not going to help Europe a lot. They don't have any of that. I don't think we're going to get our world war, no matter how much, how atrocious of things that certain factions, certain resentful factions, the neocons, as their one faction's called, or I don't think we're going to get our world war. And the reason is that China and Russia and Iran are way too powerful now. They're way too strong. They all also are on the same continent. That is very hard for us to get to anything substantive, anything that we would need to really destroy, because we're a sea power. That's a land power. It's very hard for a sea power to conquer a land power. That's why we've kept them all divided for centuries, right? So were we to go to war with Russia, China, Iran, we would lose, and we would lose very badly, and probably within a couple of years. So and Russia and China in particular went through their own horrible, horrible last century that killed hundreds of millions of their own people. They're just now truly rebuilding. China's got some internal structural issues, and that's a separate capital issue, because that's $60 trillion of artificial real estate. 60 trillion, right? That's like 30 years of global baseline GDP went into ghost cities. Oh, and by the way, that's not just the Chinese that have their wealth wiped out, because how many investors in Evergreen and et cetera, et cetera. This is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth just going to get wiped. It's being wiped out. 30 years of baseline GDP. So China, I don't think we're going to get our world war. With respect to Europe and the UK, the inflows of capital to the United States, because we do have baseline, we can develop baseline quality collateral just by reshoring manufacturing, just by being energy independent. Forget all that, fossil and nuclear, forget all that ludicrous, stupid, green, expensive shit.
Solar and wind.
Yeah. I mean, some small amounts of it, et cetera, it works, right? It's great. Like my parents have a solar set up on their house, and they don't pay for electricity. My father bought his one luxury for his one indulgence in his whole life. He bought an electric truck, which he can charge without having, himself. So I mean, that type of level works, but
it's not viable at scale, though. Is the thing?
It's just not. No, yeah. And when you're in this type of financial, so I want to get back to Europe in a moment, but when you're in this type of financial situation, there's two things you have to do, and then there's some other things that you can do. One of the things you have to do is dramatically lower the cost of energy, and not by percentages, but by orders of magnitude, right? You need to 2x, 3x, 5x, 20x if you can, 100x better. Drop the cost of energy. That fundamentally shifts pricing of everything, right? Cost and pricing of everything. And you have to dramatically increase the availability of energy now that it's so much lower cost, et cetera. We can do that with fossil fuels, and we can do that with nuclear. right? And we don't need 20 years to build these big 3 Mile Island nuclear. We can do pebble bed nuclear reactors, have them up in 2 or 3 years, all over, right? They're very safe, very secure, et cetera. Okay, so that's one. The other one is you have to either dramatically lower the cost of labor, hence importing tens of millions of frickin' people who will be in basically a slave state for their entire life if we don't give them citizenship. And even if we give them citizenship, they're going to be the low-class citizens, most of them, not all of them, of course, for for a generation or two. So you have to dramatically lower the cost of labor, and or you have to, and this is the path Germany went, you have to dramatically improve the quality of your labor, meaning productivity wise, innovation, productivity, et cetera. And then there's all kinds of other things you have to do. One of the things we're going to have to do is debt forgiveness. Like, I know all these arguments about student loans, et cetera, we're going to have to excuse student loans because Gen X started this problem. If you look, and we're a small enough generation, nobody really gives a damn, right? But Gen X has a fraction, as a group, has a fraction of the assets of their parents. Millennials have even less. Gen Z has even less. Now, some of millennials and Gen Z is going to be addressed by the passing of the boomers and inheritance, which is why Trump and them needed to get in now, because otherwise the state would have taken as much of that inheritance or all of it as they could, which would destroy that to fund itself. So in that process, then you're also you've got to rebuild the middle class. You've got to help them with loans, business loans, et cetera. You've got to stop going to these single source, these big box stores, these big box manufacturers, et cetera, because that doesn't get out to enough people. That doesn't create the quality collateral you need in the system and sufficiency and spread out around the regional banks, et cetera, for a thriving economy and a thriving populace. All right, back to Europe. If Europe is looking at, and the UK are looking at impoverishment, and they're not going to get the world war to keep the thing going and reset all of the, to kick in force majeure clause and billions of contracts, hundreds of millions, if not billions of contracts, to reset their debt, to reset all the obligations, to reset their social obligation contracts, et cetera. What might they be willing to do? And because the US can do the things I was just articulating with dramatically lower prices, improve the quality of labor. I don't think we're going to go for labor cost reduction. I think what we will do, and we can do, is go for substantially improving the quality of our labor, the output per labor. I do have some concerns with housing and some other things, but okay. Because of that, and our ability to charge, to pay higher interest, because we've got collateral assets, energy independent, yada yada. Okay, that capital that Europe needs to flow into it is going to come here. Makes way more sense, unless there's a civil war here, unless there's conflict here everywhere, all over the place. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but they're trying to take the world to nuclear war right now. What might they do, right? There are arguments being made by people smarter than I am in these things and way more knowledgeable that the US Civil War was a British color revolution that failed.
Well, I mean, I'm still of the opinion that the British still want all their colonies back, but
that's
a rabbit hole for sure.
I would, right? So great things happened last night. I had to. One of the things you learn in startups and special operations is when you get a chance to sleep because you don't know what the hell's going to be when you wake up and what you have to deal with. So I went to sleep last night. It was great news to wake up to the results. Absolutely great. But now the hard work begins. And we're dealing with far more than just, our competing political party and the mob state, et cetera. We're dealing as a superpower in a global environment where half the empire is actually not our friends, our own empire, Europe, the UK, because we can't afford the Marshall Plan anymore.
Yeah, I
So
think
what might they do? What might they do?
It's pretty interesting because there's basically I think no line that these people won't cross as far as what they're willing to do, like you said. But with some of the stuff you're saying on Mike's podcast and some of the stuff you're just saying over the last 10, 15 minutes, as far as collateral and there not being enough collateral in the system, I'd be maybe not some pushback, but just I guess just some food for thought is there enough collateral if we get like a gold on the yield curve type situation, like Judy Shelton has talked about, or commodities start to reprice higher, or like tariffs start to bring back manufacturing to the US? Like, is there a way to maybe not reverse collateral in the system to kind of right? Because the path we're on right now, at least currently, was unsustainable. But is there stuff that could be done to basically start to fix the system?
Well, as I said with Mike and some others, I've got no problem, as Jung said, right? Jung said, develop your shadow, face your shadow. I got no problem looking at the darkness, but I'm very optimistic. So I believe that there are things that can happen. One of the things I am concerned with the things I'm hearing out of the big billionaires who brought about last night, and got to thank the princes for that. They are princes in the old ways. I'm still hearing trickle down thinking, and trickle down doesn't work. You got to fix the top. You got to fix, their level, and you got to do these things that only they can do at their level. But I'm not hearing the rebuilding, plussing up, expanding the middle class, helping the middle class with their debt burdens. And I'm not hearing anything about collateral creation for Gen Z and millennials in particular. And we can take care of some of the big collateral stuff, but you need your population to have homes that they, not just rent, but to have homes that they own, that there's a mortgage on. You need them to be able to buy cars, all of these types of, you need them to have assets in the markets, right? You need, and some funds in the bank, right? These are collectively, in aggregate, that's a lot of collateral. That's good, solid collateral in the regional banks in particular. If we can figure that out, and that's actually the path I started on 24 years ago, because I could see where this was going in the tech space and in conversations we were having in Silicon Valley at the time. How do we bring Silicon Valley, Wall Street-like financial capabilities to the middle class? And how do we restructure? And honestly, how do we not fall into the debt trap of Japan, where it has a declining population, massive debt burdens that it's never actually really, what NPL, non-performing loans, that it's never really actually written down. So, because of the carry trade that everybody is benefiting from. So if we can do substantive debt structuring for the middle class, and there's going to have to be a lot of debt forgiveness. And I believe firmly that we're going to have to forgive a large portion of student loans, because it is just crushing two generations. I know there's a lot of thinking among some people that, the boomers are passing, they're going to pass on their assets, et cetera. $2 trillion of that's just going to go right to student loans. You know what I mean? It's and not be at work in, in the economy at the local levels where it needs to be for real assets and collateral to be created in sufficient numbers. And hopefully millennials can afford to start having kids one day, and Gen Z, because we need those people down the road. So I think we can. We are a resource rich country. We are a information and knowledge rich country. We are, before the shenanigans of the last 40-ish years, we're an industrialist people, mercantile people. We can fix these problems, but it's going to take there are $50 trillion, $100 trillion, I don't know. Maybe it's less than that, but there's at least tens of trillions of dollars of debt that's going to have to get forgiven, going to have to get restructured, going to have to get covered in some other way, in order for us to be able to build that collateral amongst enough of our people to, ensure that our financial system and banking system and markets are built on solid ground.
Yeah, I think the student loan thing is pretty interesting because you have like a lot of colleges, especially for out of state, and like tuition rates are probably 75,000 now for some of the so-called top end colleges. Like that's not a recipe for success for younger generations, but I've heard people talking about basically putting universities and some of the endowments on the hook for student loans. Because I mean, like Harvard's kind of turned into a just an example, a hedge fund with a university attached, and there's other places that are like football teams with a university attached, right? And so I think there's ways to do that without basically blowing things up too bad. But
I think the universities killed themselves, and I don't think they're going to recover.
No, I think that they're definitely gonna start shrinking as far as number of colleges out there, and there's gonna be a lot of people that there's a lot of people that look at what you get out of a university education. Like I've learned more in the last 4 or 5 years since I've graduated than I did like through the entire schooling process. And when I kind of look back on my time in public accounting, like you had to do an extra year of school, which for me, in-state tuition was not ridiculous, but it was just a waste of time. And then you have to jump through all these hoops, take the tests for the CPA and all this other garbage. And the work I was actually doing was stuff I could do in like 7th or 8th grade. Like it's not rocket science. And so there's that mismatch there where it just is creating bottlenecks for smart people. And it's frustrating to kind of see it happen. But I think a big time retooling of the education system is kind of coming, if not already starting. So
I think it's done. I had sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I had a conversation with a very successful friend of mine this morning, actually, before our call. He was calling to gloat because I was concerned the election wasn't going to go this way. And he had told me a couple months ago that it would. But I was having this conversation with him. His children's mother, his ex-wife, they're Swiss. And so his kids have Swiss citizenship. His kids can go to school in Switzerland, and Switzerland will pay them to go to school, right? So there are countries, especially in Europe, right? And I think it's going to happen more here in the education system here, where schools will use their endowments to pay students to go to their school because countries, because of the competitiveness of the need,
because they're gifted, or
like I think I only saw part of the acceptance speech this morning, but Trump was talking about Elon. He said Elon's a genius, and we need to protect our geniuses. We need to, we don't have a lot of them, and we need to protect them. And this is going to come across, maybe tick off a lot of people, but the worst thing that ever happened was sending everybody to college, because you put the marginally intelligent, the kids in the center of the distribution with the kids on with the kids on one end of the tail, and you realize that's a whole different level of intelligence. And how the hell do I compete with that? It's like, well, you don't, and you don't need to, right?
Yeah, and you're not supposed to. And
And
it
you're not
just turns
supposed
colleges
to.
into a situation where they have to like cater to the lowest common denominator, right?
Correct.
And
Correct.
it just is
Correct.
it's a shit
Yeah.
show. But
Yeah.
the other thing too is like if you look at like countries paying for tuition as an example, like you can't really run that if you have open borders and you have like kind of the welfare state that we kind of have now. But that may be an interesting way to pivot into what you think might happen with immigration if we get deportations, because that would feed through to more affordable real estate and all these other things. And if you basically just go through and start with the criminals that are here illegally and start working your way down that kind of priority list, like that, I think has a huge positive impact on basically heritage Americans. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on if that starts to play out once Trump's in office.
I think we could, yes, I think it's going to happen. I think we're going to see mass deportations. And I agree, it's going to be the criminals first. It's going to be the mentally insane, I do believe that a good number of people, millions of people will stay here, but they'll be the right people, right? I'm I'm an immigrant myself, right? Not me. I was born in the United States, but my family and a recent immigrant. So I think we're already seeing, as the election was going on, or as the campaign was going on, you started to see the Biden-Harris administration start to, react to the border, et cetera. So I believe very firmly border is going to be a big deal. We are going to deport a lot of people, millions of people. And the real numbers of people who come in over the last 30 years or so is probably closer to 80 million. We don't know.
If not 100. I mean, who knows?
It may be 100. Yeah. So, we're going to see a lot of people deported. The housing issue, though, is being blamed on immigrants, and that's only partially true. The other problem we have is real estate speculation. In San Francisco, something like 20+%, 25% of the apartments and houses sit empty because they're investments by wealthy individuals who are parking capital there, and nobody can afford to pay the rent. So they, get their tax write-offs and et cetera. So, and this is the same in Manhattan. It's the same in every major city, right? So Dallas, Austin, et cetera. So I don't know how to address that. I'm not a real estate guy. The friend that called me this morning, he is a builder. So while there is some strain on housing availability in the lower and lower middle area, this real estate speculation and the Airbnb thing are playing a far bigger part of the unavailability. That doesn't deal with the pricing, though, right? The cost. So it's not just about availability, it's also about the cost of homes and cost of mortgages and rents, et cetera. So we've been inflating all assets since the last commodity super cycle that ended in the in the 60s, when we went off the gold standard and went to fiat currency. That's the equivalent of taking silver, out of Roman coins, right? The treasury was putting less and less actual silver in there, right? Initially it started with snipping off, parts of it, and then it just less silver until finally you had very little silver at all. Well, that's what we did with the fiat, right? Moving to the fiat currency, that's exactly what we've been doing. And so 60, 70 years of asset appreciation is artificial. It's artificial. So how do we address that? Particularly when we have these massive debts that are all priced in that, so I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough about all of that to know how that gets fixed. But it's not just, let's not blame everything on immigrants, right? Or illegal immigrants. There's a lot of major structural issues that we have to deal with. And the primary one is a ludicrous overvaluation of assets. And this is in the markets as well. I remember when I was, doing startup companies, and we took a company public back in mid 90s. and I worked on others when I was in investment banking and analysis. If you had a company that had above a 7, 8 PE, you were in kind of la land, depending on which industry, right? Tech was out there. We're at what now? 15, 20, 25, 100 times price, PEs.
Yeah.
So
Costco's at like a 60 PE. There's other stuff out there that's like 100 plus. Like
right.
It's amazing to see, and this is maybe a good place to pivot into some of the market dynamics and some of the stuff there, because you have all this stuff where, like, I've kind of started to realize over the last couple of years that the market is not, or at least it isn't anymore, about like valuing a business or valuing assets. It's more kind of this liquidity driven, like speculative set of bubbles. And you've got like passive investing, which is like the self-reinforcing cycle of money flows. You've got the high frequency trading, which, like, they don't, like, if they're in there for half a second or less, they don't care what the fundamental value of something is, right? And you kind of look at stuff like commodities has been underinvested in for 15 years, and it's kind of like the anti-bubble side of this, while like you've got all these big tech stocks that are, I mean, trading at valuations that I don't think make a whole lot of sense. But I'd be curious to hear kind of your thoughts on kind of some of those dynamics in public markets, and what you think is the most interesting part of what's going on now.
Yeah, so great question. My generation, Gen X, is, as in whole, dealing with a pretty bleak future financially. And a big part of that is because of the dot-com era. Because a lot of us focused, a lot of capital, a lot of attention went into the dot-com era. We thought that was going to give us the capital assets, right? Build this portfolio of capital assets. And so a lot of people piled into that. A lot of people at a key age, right? We were in our, mid to late 20s, early 30s at the time. A lot of our most productive capital building years got wiped out. Millennials went through the same thing, right? And then there was the second one, which was the early part of millennials, latter part of the Gen X, when we should have been building assets, got wiped out with the housing crisis, the manufactured housing crisis. Millennials got hit a second time. So like my generation got hit the second time with the housing crisis, your generation got hit the second time with the crypto scams, some of which are legitimate, some of which real, but a vast amount of energy and money and time, years, went into crypto and NPCs, and it's not NPCs, the digital assets, right?
What are they called? The monkey
NFCs.
JPEG.
The Bored Ape Yacht Club.
NFTs, the non-fungible tokens.
The
NFTs.
Right? So that's
I've managed to avoid that. That's why I don't know what they're called.
Awesome. Yeah, same. We were looking to launch a token in 2016, 2017. We worked on, et cetera, for investing, small, early startups, smaller startups, et cetera, and how do we use that mechanism to have an investment fund and give the limited partners some say, and et cetera. We wound up pulling back out of it because our attorney said, unless you raise $1/3 billion and set aside $50 million for lawsuits, regulatory lawsuits, I wouldn't do it. So we pulled away. But point being is that 2 generations now, and the beginning of Z, but let's leave them out, have had their 2 most important time frames in which they should have been focused on energy, mindset, revenue, money that they were bringing in, should have gone into hard assets, right? Collateralized assets, or assets that would be used as collateral for different stages in their life. And Gen X got wiped out twice. And millennials have gotten wiped out twice. So how do we address that, right? How do you address it when you have, again, back to, all the, this ludicrous asset pricing increase over the last 40 years? I don't know exactly. Right? I don't know. Commodities are going to rise again. It's inevitable, right? So we're going back to hard assets, right? Hard collateral, which has to happen. It's astounding. It's either going to be the U.S. Or BRICS that's going to roll out a gold-backed currency. I don't think it's going to be, I think reserve currency, and again, there's people way smarter than I am in this, but, we are going back to and have to go to fix all these other problems. At the base has to be collateralized, assets, and that includes currency, right? You got to have some kind of hard collateral behind it in terms of, and that's commodities, right? Whether it's gold or it's some portfolio of commodities. I don't, again, that's not my area of expertise, but I've heard people talking about both. I've heard people talking about partial coupons for the bonds and treasuries where, maybe up to 10%. So back to the question, and I have another friend closer to your age, Max. He has a small fund, and that's because he saw this kind of coming. He didn't get into the crypto stuff as well for the very same reasons that, we probably didn't. And that's what he did 5 years ago. He put together a small fund that invested in mining companies, which have been cleaning up their books for 20 some odd years. But my best friend in school, his father was an executive in the mining industry since we were kids, until he passed away from Agent Orange. I would highly recommend, and I'm not making investment advice, etc., but my generation and your generation have now been screwed quite literally into great scam periods at critical periods in our life. So now how do we catch up? We're going to have to invest in commodities. We're going to have to put some money and effort and understand, and whether that's the mining companies or it's the commodities themselves. And, I don't know about I was doing oil futures 2 years ago. That's what I was doing, trying to understand and play. And we noticed, I remember it was like 6:07 a.m. I was on Pacific time one morning. This huge information dump came into the options in the base market that drove the market up and down simultaneously for about 6 seconds. And then after that, everything was algorithmic. So if you're going to get into commodities and the futures, again, is what I was doing, be careful. There's some big freaking computational machines out there that they're dominating those markets. So, how do you not get caught on the other side of, a $1 billion or $3 billion AI machine? Right?
Yeah.
So personally, I think what we're going to have to, terribly sorry, I think what we're going to have to do, and this goes back to what I've been working on for 20 some odd years, is we're going to have, for our generations, we're going to have to create our own capital assets for stock companies. Go local, go small, go regional. If we focused on, and this gets to the labor, the quality of labor, et cetera. If we started to build a whole lot of, the kind of the vision of the .com, but instead of doing it with tech companies and .com companies, do it with your business. Yeah, it costs some money, and yes, it's some more money than an LLC or an S corp, right? But you get other protections, and you're creating a capital asset that opens up other funding opportunities and growth opportunities, et cetera. So why not? And I've had this conversation with billionaires, right? It's like, okay, yes, we made our fortunes in that game 30, 40 years ago. Why not open it up to other people now? We have the technical capabilities. It costs so much less to build companies now and to manage companies, to do the account, all of the these tools that we've built technologically over the last 30, 40 years, let's use it for more and more people. Let's, we should have, I'm just throwing a number out there, right? But over the next 4 years, we should have 1 million small C corps created by millennials and Gen X to address local business needs, local and regional business needs. That would solve a lot of problems right there. One is creating solid collateral assets, right, in the form of companies and business and revenues. It's helping individuals build capital assets, because we're in a return on capital economy, and that's not going to change, right? It's a knowledge base that's out there. We know how to do it. We've been doing it for 60 years with Silicon Valley. It's what Wall Street would pay attention to, because now you've got a lot more. You're not having to park vast amounts of capital in the fangs, right? And you're not having to sustain 60-70% of the companies that are in the capital markets that are ghost companies. The only reason they're on the markets at all anymore is because they can continue to buy debt, right? To support themselves through debt. And none of that, that's not rebuilding the middle class, right? And reshoring manufacturing, big manufacturing, isn't going to rebuild the middle class. It's not going to provide the depth of constantly new collateral in the form of businesses and companies and revenues and production, et cetera, that's necessary for the middle class and the lower middle class, right? It'll help the upper class, and it'll help labor, but most of that stuff's going to be automated just for cost reasons alone and quality reasons.
Yeah,
so
interesting. I think that I want to transition before we wrap up to like the potential impact of a Trump presidency, but one of those topics I think kind of follows right on with what we were just talking about, and he's been talking about tariffs and some of the stuff there. I've talked to a couple of people that basically say, right, if you get tariffs, deregulation, and you like basically do it correctly, like he was kind of saying that we get a small business and middle class boom similar to what we saw like in the Gilded Age, when the per capita wealth and the growth of that economy, like before income taxes and before all that, like it was basically a very good time for all Americans, not just the top percentage. But I'd be curious to hear if you think potentially getting rid of the income tax, replacing it with tariffs, deregulation, if that does lead to a booming middle class, a kind of explosion in the creation of small businesses, if that's kind of a step on the path in the right direction on kind of the collateral creation and the stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, totally. And when you look historically, those things have to happen, right? However, we have one major problem, conceptual problem, and we can overcome it. But when was the last time that we had a major antitrust lawsuit that went through the courts and broke up a major corporation? 84, AT&T, right?
Yeah,
so
long time.
The problem that we have right now is the financial system and the banking system are heavily dependent upon the capital markets and the valuation of assets in the capital markets. And you have to have these massive conglomerate companies. This all started with the LBO days, in the late 70s into the early 90s, leveraged buyout days, Michael Milken, and bad paper, right? Bad debt, but debt fueled growth. So the problem that we have right now is we're in a bit of a catch-22, and the bit of the catch-22 is we have an entire large generation that's retiring that has a large portion of their assets, capital assets, in the markets, and those markets are being propped up by major corporations. And you have to have that, because what are we going to do? We're going to rob, the older aging out generation of their retirements that they spent decades building. So the problem that we have is we have massive funds going into massive corporations that then go on the markets, and we're all heavily focused on that. How do we, and you have companies like Amazon was supposed to be the store for a whole lot of small businesses, but what winds up turning out is, I have a friend of mine who did this at Amazon. He left because it angered him so much. But a lot of those little companies, those little products, et cetera, are made by Amazon now. Right? It got the market data.
Yeah, they do
right.
Basically cannibalizing their own. Yeah.
Correct. So, the problem that we have is, in order for the tariffs and the tax stuff to go away and all of that to work, we have to retool. And some of this actually is happening in the banking system with SOFR, where now SOFR is determined regionally, right? The lending rates are determined regionally. In order for this to really work, though, for the middle class to rebuild and regrow, we have to get away from monopolistic practices in the country. We have to go after some of these monopolies and break them up. But more important than going after malevolent or malicious or very destructive monopolies, we have to get away from centralized manufacturing. We've got to get away from the concept of big box stores. We've got to go back to local and small. We've got to go back to addressing local, small community issues. Local and regional economies have to rebuild themselves. If we can get into that mindset, which is hard because look, we've got pricing advantages, right? Things are going to cost a little more. Now, if you're sharing more of that cost increase amongst your local and regional economy, the cost increase of not going with the big monopoly is offset. And you're building, if you're doing, capital asset, again, I mean, C Corps in particular, because some of those are going to go on. Now you can convert from an LLC to, and again, I'm not the most intelligent there, or knowledgeable. But again, for those things to work for anybody but the really big guys, we have to reorient our thinking to local and regional on mass scale. And I mean, over the next 4 years, we should have 1 million new companies started, right? Small to medium-sized companies, 1 million of them. And there needs to be consolidation of some, and you know what I mean? There's the normal dynamism of a healthy, distributed industrial business economic base.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic about the next 4 years hold, but are you, as far as the rest of the kind of geopolitical picture or anything else with potential Trump presidency, is there anything else you're watching there?
Well, the next 4 years are important because they can put a lot of things in place. But the reality is, this same focus on the regime, on the mob state, the Praetorian system, we've got to continue to down. That's going to take at least 12 years, maybe 20 years. So people have got to stay as actively engaged in these things for the rest of our lives, literally, even your generation. We have, because we took our eyes off it for 40 some odd years, maybe more, maybe 60 years, and it got to this. So it doesn't get turned around with 4 years. It doesn't get turned around with 8 years. It doesn't get turned around with 12 years. It's going to take 20, 30, 40 years to, now, there'll be improvements, of course, right? But we got to stay actively engaged. At the same time, Europe is dying. They are dying for all kinds of reasons. Well, they just created 1 million casualties in Ukraine, killed 700,000 Ukrainian men. They're now, been shanghaiing them off the streets for a year plus. They're willing to take the world to nuclear war to sustain themselves. So while we have these structural things that we need to work on here, the reorientation here, the downsizing of the administrative state here, from the universities across the board and everything, while we have to help our population build collateral assets, quality collateral assets on the large scale with millions of people benefiting from that, we're also in a geopolitical environment where we have our grandparents, basically, Europe, our grandparents and great grandparents who are willing to do absolutely anything to sustain themselves, to include driving a civil war here in the United States so that capital doesn't flow into the US, it flows to other places that are not caught up in civil war. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but
Yeah.
as a former unconventional warfare guy, I might do it.
Yeah, I think anything's on the table at this point when you kind of look at the last 4 or 5 years in particular, where, like you said, I think a lot of things have been running in the background for 4 decades, but over the last 4 or 5 years, like if you haven't woken up at least a little bit to some of the stuff going on, then I think you're kind of just not paying attention. So,
What?
I think
I think
it's
that's
starting to become more
exactly,
obvious to a lot of people. But
terribly
go
sorry.
ahead.
I believe that's why Trump was chosen and Trump was put out in place in front, because he's actually clean. He's actually clean. What he does is actually legitimate. He knows these people because he grew up with them, the mob state, the regime, etc. I mean, he even said it back in 2016 or something, how do you know this stuff? He's like, well, because I've been benefiting from it for my whole, to go from $400 million in inheritance to 10 billion or so.
You're telling me there was no Russian collusion?
No, that's all been way debunked. But the point is, he's clean. They put him out in front specifically because of his personality to draw out the mob state, so we could all see it, so everybody could see it, right? See it so obviously, so clearly. We do see it now, all of us across. I'm not a Republican, not a Democrat, I'm not an independent. I don't get into a camp. I'm a centrist and I'm a humanist, right? I'm a centrist and I'm a humanist. I think a lot more of us, that's why I wrote the book, The Eternal War. We need to stop thinking about left, right, all this linguistic complex camps that we've, allowed to develop, that we put ourselves in, that we all fight over. It's all artificial. It's all right. So a lot more of us are conscious of this mob state, this Praetorian regime, because of the last 4 years. We can't go back. We can't just think that it goes away because of an election or 4 years of a presidency, or let's say Vance is in for 8 years after that, or 12, right? This is here. It is a eternal, I titled the book, The Eternal War, for a reason. This is an eternal conflict. And we can write this stuff. There is going to be some hardship, right? There's going to be some hardship. We've got way more debt and structural problems that we can work through, but there needs to be a hard recession to clean out, right? Like a forest fire. We've not allowed it, literally, genuinely, we've not had a legitimate hard recession since the 1970s. And I was a kid in the 70s. I remember how hard those were, but we've not, since we went on the fiat system, we've not allowed a fundamental recession to occur. Everything's been manipulated. And so it's going to have to happen. There's no way there's no way anymore to do that. So this is something that we're going to have to get through some hard, lean years. Things are getting set in place now. By the way, stuff that's going to start in January has already started. And the reality is all these things behind the scenes have been happening over the last 4 years. Regime, mob state or Praetorian regime or not, right? The princes have been moving and coming together around the few responsible princes. So next 4 years, things get set in place. Our generations, millennial, my generation, Gen X, millennial generation, Gen Z, we're going to have to carry on this work the rest of our life for our kids and our grandkids, right? And for the rest of the world. We are still a major power. That's not good. We're going to have to pull back from the empire, just cost-wise alone. But we are still a massive country, a massive economy, massive amount of natural resources. So we got our work cut out for us.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. That kind of leads right into the last question I wanted to ask before I let you go. As far as the future of the U.S., like, it's going to be an interesting run from here to 2030, I think. But longer term, like, I'm very optimistic about the direction things are headed. I think in my lifetime, we get something closer to a monarchy or more centralized government, which I think would be good. But as far as the future of the U.S., like, what do you think we have in store for us over the next maybe 10 years and then longer term, if you have any thoughts there?
It's so wonderful question and very keen observation, because what comes next inevitably in these cycles, unless somehow the laws of physics and the universe and history have actually broken, we already have a multi-generational aristocracy now in the form of family offices, the oligarchs and family offices, ludicrous fortunes, right? That is an aristocracy. They don't know yet, and they've been learning over the last 4 years, and they're now shaping up into a nobility, right? This is my work, by the way. I've been working on this for years, trying to understand this. I'm writing a novel on it right now called Israel Burns, to go into all these concepts and ideas. Depending on what happens over the next, into the late 2030s, there is still a good chance of a civil war. Still a good chance for all kinds of reasons. Maybe it won't happen, but historically, generally what happens in that is the aristocracy becomes more engaged, more connected to the people, more formally an entity, less this removed, distant investor class, capital asset class. Generally, what normally comes out of that is a monarchy. Like what came out of the Soviet collapse, what came out of the Maoist collapse? Well, now you have a czar again, and you have an emperor again, Putin and Xi. And they didn't do it by, battle. That's not how power, that's not how these systems happen. It isn't conquest and murdering your own people. You get taken out that way. It's being competent. And the oligarchs realizing, okay, this administrative bureaucratic state is the enemy. We have to use it. We have to have some form of it, but it is the enemy of the people and us. And that's what I'm starting to see. And there has to be some transition. There has to be some transition. You're absolutely right. And so that's what I'm seeing shaping up. And don't think for a second the administrative state isn't going to fight back. It always has, right? The bureaucratic system, bureaucratic state. And, I don't remember if I was speaking with Mike about this, but, that's what Constantine did. Constantine went to Rome in the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 and crushed the Praetorians. And the ones that survived, he sent to the different corners of the empire under the auspices that if you ever combine or come together again, we will kill you. I will kill you. Right? Because that's what it took, because Rome collapsed because of, what happened to Rome happened because of the Praetorian regime, the Praetorian Guard. And the Praetorian Guard weren't just the security guards and et cetera, right? It was power, and it owned the emperors. Your security owns you. So how do you deal with that? Well, guess what? Feudal system addressed that. So to your question, where are we going? I believe very much we are already in the early days of a modern feudalist system. We just don't recognize it. Some do. Kotkin and some others are talking about it openly. But when I was in Silicon Valley in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were already talking about feudalism. Like, all of this is going to break, all this unsustainable. The conversation was already like, what are we going to do with all of this change? And it was like, well, guess what? Turns out feudalism had a lot of power, had a lot of beneficial things as to the conceptually and in practice, it did a pretty good job of balancing power between princes, bureaucratic states, and the people. Right? And so today it's not geography based, it's where is, so who is the prince today? It's not somebody owns this giant tract of land, although that's happening too. But it's where is my capital, not where, in who is my capital at work, right? That's the new feudal, domain.
Yeah.
And now we've got to bring more people from, the lower and lower middle classes and the middle class into that, right? Can't just be the big money people in the upper middle class, et cetera. So,
yeah, I think it'll be interesting to watch. You definitely given the listeners a lot to think about. But before I let you go, I have a traditional closing question I ask all my guests, and that is, what book do you think I should add to my reading list? It can be financial, markets, or history, or it could be your book if you're wanting to plug your own work. But what do you think I should add to the reading list?
So not to plug my own work, but to I think everybody should read the Eternal War. It's a 2-3 hour read, but it's very dense in information. In order for us to get through the next, I would say 15 years, if we can get through the next 15 years, staying as engaged as we are now, or as I should say, as we were yesterday, right, with everything. If we can stay that, because today people got hangovers and they're tired, and et cetera. But and there's some euphoria. But if we can all stay as engaged as we were over the last, let's say 4 years, and really this last year, for the next 15 years into the late 2030s, I think we'll be on a pretty good track. To do that, we have to understand fundamentals, who we actually really are, what are we really dealing with, and how do we and how did the enemy, resentfuls and responsibles is how I identified in the book, how do we really function and how do we really operate? And how do we conceptualize that, not in the ways that we've been taught over the last 200 years, because all of that is weaponized now. We've got to get back to more basic, more fundamental things that are down underneath still, right? And that's the Eternal War, which is set against by the infinite game. And what we need to be doing, which is the whole conversation we're having, is we need to dramatically, substantively improve, expand the infinite game, which is how all these things happen, right? But we can't do that if we don't recognize that we are locked also in an eternal war with, for all intents and purposes, a parasitic, class that we'll never be able to get rid of. So the Eternal War.
If my readers were looking for more of your work or your social media or a place to find you, where should they look?
X is probably the best place. It's mostly where I do most of my communication. I have been serialized releasing the Eternal War on locals. I'm going to close that down. So I am on Medium and Substack. I'm going to get back into writing the Eternal War, but the first 21 chapters or so are going to be available over the next, I'll roll them out one every week or 2 weeks, which goes into a lot of this stuff in far more detail. It's called As Rome Burns, and you can find it under my name, EM Burlingame, on Medium or Substack. And then again, people can reach out to you now that we're connected.
Yeah, awesome. I'll make sure to put those links in the descriptions and below everywhere this will go out. But I think with that, we'll be wrapping up. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.